right, so now clicking.
I don't use OBS for
And we're live. All right, so that should be good. Everybody let us know in the comments about the audio quality, if you can hear both of us, how the levels are. We're very happy today to be here with Tom Rousel of Survive the Jive. I'm guessing that most of you guys already know who Tom is, but he's been making really high quality documentaries, videos about the European pagan traditions, traditional folk ways. Some of my favorites have been on like little known kind of rituals and sacred places. Like you had a video on holes that I thought was very entertaining.
I'm glad you said that because nobody ever says that about, and that was one of, I was proud of that one, but it didn't seem to be very interesting to a lot of people.
No, I loved it. Yeah, very unique takes out of Tom. And, so there's been a bit of discussion recently about paganism in our spheres and what exactly paganism means. Now, Tom, like myself, I think identifies as a Platonist. Is that correct?
Yeah, with some caveats, yes. I mean, I don't take the starting point of Platonism and then, expand out there from my.
Oh, I think we lost Tom, unfortunately. Now you've come back in. Sorry.
Or was there a problem with my audio?
Yeah, you cut off for just a minute. I think it was your connection, actually.
All right. What I was saying is that it's true to say that I am influenced by Platonic philosophy in my religion. Right, maybe I'm not a true Platonist, but I think there's differences between the Platonists themselves. So it's hard to tell which is the true Platonic, which one is truly a Platonist. I certainly disagree with some of the things some of the Platonists say. But also, can I just say thank you for having me, Eric? And I've been enjoying your talks for a few years now, and your channel. So you have some interesting thoughts, and it's nice to hear you discuss these topics.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I noticed that you are very active in finding talent out there, smaller channels on YouTube. I'll often find, like I recently found EC Winsper, and lo and behold, there in the comments 2 months ago, Survive the Jive. So you beat me to it on that one. But yeah.
I tried to boost him as well. I tried to boost these small channels and get people aware of them because there's some people doing really good content, but I don't really understand why it doesn't reach its audience, but yeah.
Right. I think it's, you got started very early on YouTube when the algorithm was in a different state. I mean, it's no excuse for me. So did I. And yet my channel never grew. But I think you put a lot more work into your videos than I do mine. Mine has always been just kind of my personal philosophy and anecdotes and musings and stuff. But yeah, so you raise a question, what is the true Platonism? And that's kind of the question that has been raised regarding paganism recently. How would you define, first of all, just what is paganism? You self-identify as a pagan. Would you say there is such a thing as the true paganism? Is there something that's most authentically, in line with our ancestral roots in that vein? Or is there like one kind of ideal form of paganism, that leans more towards this kind of classical antiquity, high theology, Proclus, Plato? Like what exactly is the spectrum there of paganisms out there? And is there really a true one? I think you're muted.
Apologies. That's a reasonable question to ask. I think it's best to start with the problems with the prejudices we take as modern Westerners when approaching the topic of religion. Paganism isn't a religion, and the notion of religion, I'm sure you know this point has been made, it's quite a common point to make by anthropologists, historians, and people who study ancient religions. The idea of religion is very modernistic. It comes from early modern times, the idea that people have segmented religious beliefs and they exist independently of the other ones. And we British have imposed that on places like India. The idea of Hinduism is very much a British construct because these various philosophies within India often differ very much from each other. They do have some commonalities and they do have some aspects of common origin, but by grouping them into one, religion, as discrete from Islam, it was helpful for us to distinguish Muslims and non-Muslims, etc., in that continent, subcontinent. Similarly, we do the same thing when we're talking about Greek paganism or Roman paganism, Germanic paganism. Paganism, broadly in modern English, refers to any pre-Christian religion. It has been used in the past to refer to non-European peoples as well. Some anthropologists today would say that was offensive because they see paganism as pejorative and therefore it's a form of colonialist racism to use that term. But most people don't have a problem with it being used to refer to pre-Christian European religions. I'm using the term religion myself here with the caveat I've already said. But the thing is that these weren't perceived as religions at the time. They were perceived as traditions and ways, just like languages. I think the best thing, the way of thinking of them is like languages. Like, what is it to be a Hellen, a Greek? Well, Hellen is someone who speaks the Greek language and worships the Greek gods. That's why Gemistus Pletho was called the last Hellene, even though there were many Greek speakers all around him. It was because he worshipped the gods in the medieval times. So I think that to say one true paganism is misleading, of course, because just as there are many philosophies within the Indian subcontinent, the indigenous religions of that region, there were we know, for example, within Greece and Rome, there were all kinds of different competing philosophies. And when someone like Plato comes along with some religious beliefs that go against the orthodox and widely practiced form of the state religion, he is not then perceived as someone with a different religion. He's someone perceived with different ideas. But the idea of religion is something that binds people together, a shared belief system, is not quite appropriate in that context. So within each pagan tradition, within each region, there were differences of opinion and differences of local custom. Obviously, some of these just come from regional differences, but when we can see the examples in Egypt and the Greek-speaking world, including the Greek Levant, that there are also individual philosophers, charismatic leaders, etc., who put forward ideas and encourage people to interpret things as they choose to. And that isn't seen as a departure from tradition at the time. But we can retroactively impose that historically on things. And some people would like to see the Platonism is seen as a separate religion, perhaps, from paganism. But I don't think paganism, as I see it, I say I have paganism as a religion, but I do that because I live in a country where I'm required to write down my religion and to have and to categorize it in a way that the state can use for data purposes and that people can refer to so they can understand what I believe. So it's useful for me to just say pagan because I don't want to have to explain theology or history or anything to every person who wants to know. But there are huge amounts of variety within that paganism, and today most people practicing paganism, I think a significant amount practice a kind which doesn't actually exist in the arguably none of them exist in their present form in the ancient world, but there's some particular Wiccanism which actually has no precedent. It isn't even based on an earlier form of paganism. It's just a constructed religion by very modernistic thinkers. But I think the people who actually are attempting to continue the older traditions generally fall under the Greek or Germanic paths for the most part. And there are significant amounts of Slavic pagans in Eastern Europe, but they don't have as much interaction with the West for some reason. And I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, definitely gets us there. So that raises the further question of where Platonism fits in for you. I was referred to an interesting scholar on Proclus. I think his name was Edward P. Butler, who interpreted Proclus in a kind of curious way. And then I went and looked at some of his talks on YouTube, and some of his political opinions are problematic, I would say. But
Yes.
the way he so you're familiar with him. Yeah, his interpretation.
He referred to my work as racist trash.
Yeah, that's the problematic aspect I was talking about. But, the way he interprets Proclus in this realm of the Henads is interesting, and it didn't even seem entirely consistent with the way Proclus talks about it. Right? For those who don't know, in the kind of Platonic hierarchy of beings, we have the world and matter down here, and then the realm of souls, the realm of forms or intellect, and then above that, the one. And within this realm of the one, there are the Henads, which are often equated with the Greek gods. Right? Edward P. Butler kind of generalizes this so that all indigenous belief systems anywhere, any god that any tribe in New Guinea or wherever believes in, is one of these Henads. And for Edward, they're all equal in some fundamental sense. So that's one extreme where you could take, conceptions of paganism, even through a Platonist lens, evidently, although I don't take it to be entirely consistent, is this kind of any belief system is as good as any other. And then there's another kind of Platonizing paganism that says, no, there is a correct theology. There are more powerful gods and less powerful gods. And, there's something beyond just each of our individual kind of indigenous ways. There's some objective truth that we could all be aspiring towards, which then leads towards a much more kind of ecumenical and perhaps even globalist conception. I mean, it remains to be seen, but this is the way I see the two spectrums going, taking Platonism and applying it to paganism. So where do you see yourself in that spectrum? How do you use Platonism with your religion?
Okay, I should specify first that I'm not coming from a background of being a student of Plato and then the student of the later Platonists and trying to then fit a Germanic pagan worldview into it. I come from a background of being a scholar of Germanic religion, and I'd find the arguments from late antiquity, from the philosophers from that time, who are using polemics and arguments to come up with justifications for continuing paganism. Obviously interesting to me as a person who is in a society that does not value pagans and would and often specifically devalues them, promotes religions in my country. Religions are promoted in my country and allowed to openly talk about destruction of religious artifacts as virtues, as religious virtues. So it's obviously going to be appealing to me to see how these arguments have already been addressed by people like Julian and Celsus, who are Platonists. At least I think Celsus was a Platonist, and Celsus is particularly. I mean, there's not a lot of his work, so he's not like a big meaty thinker and contributor to the Neoplatonist tradition like Porphyry and Proclus and Iamblichus, but he's got his general philosophy is in line with mine, which is that I was already influenced by the perennial philosophy, because I do believe that obviously, it's not the case that Slavs believe in Perun and Perun is the only thunder god and the other thunder gods are just some kind of error, like Thor and Perkunos and whatever other thundering gods that every country, every people in the world came up with are errors and Perun's right. That doesn't make any sense. That's not how people then thought. We know from Interpretatio Romana that the Romans just, saw other people's gods as their own gods. And, they refer to the Ares of the Scythians. They refer to Isis of the Germans. Now, that could have been that the Scythians or the Germans had imported Egyptian and Greek gods, or it may more likely just be that they were using the terms for divine personalities that were more familiar to the literate Mediterranean audience, those are the Greeks and the Egyptians, to refer to those of barbarian peoples in the north. But the Interpretatio Romana is a bit of a crude approach to it, but it's not a philosophical approach. But I think it's generally right in the idea that the gods are equivalent. And in the True Philosophy, or the True Word by Celsus, he basically outlines a kind of perennialism where he's saying that all the peoples of the world, except Jews, have pretty much come up with a philosophy that is true, because and accept Christians, of course, because of that, because they all, even though they approach the divine in different ways and they have different, gods and different myths concerning the gods, they're all approaching the same thing in their own way with respect to the differences that other peoples will necessarily have acquired in the cultures of approaching the divinity. So that's my view, and I agree with him there. We only have his, what's passed on from Oregon. But Oregon, as Christian authors go, is actually one of my preferred ones, but because at least he's a Platonist. But I think that Iamblichus as well is useful in the way that theurgy justifies right, because some of the other Platonic thinkers seem to go against like the norms of the Roman religion or the Greek religion, and what I uphold in the Germanic religion, which is in common with all the other Indo-European religions, is their core, although this is something that has tapered off in late antiquity in Greece, and also simultaneously in the Vedanta in India. It sort of moved away from that. But the initial core is sacrifice and polytheism. So, but I like Iamblichus because he is, although for perhaps different reasons for what people in the Bronze Age would have used, but he's still trying to justify the original rites and showing that the rites are a way to become closer to the divine through his processes of theurgy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. When the Romans or whomever encountered a new people and a new set of gods, the assumption was simply that there is some thing that these people are worshiping. Just in evolutionary terms, it doesn't actually make sense that people would have all of these erroneous, ridiculous superstitions with no truth underlying them. I have my own theories as to what is going on with what polytheists call the gods. As a Christian, I wouldn't call them gods, but I recognize this realm of the Henads exists. This multiplicity of personal forces interceding into the mundane world, I think, is just obvious at a certain level. And there's gradations on that scale, more potent forces, less powerful forces. And that's, I think, the way to think about Plato is that he wasn't a radical innovator. He recognized the essential truth behind all of these indigenous belief systems of the Mediterranean and had to reconcile it with this emerging trend of rationalistic philosophy. And so he did his best to bring it all together and make sense of it. And so in that vein, there is a way of making sense of what exactly the gods are. Do you use Plato's kind of lens? Like, what are the gods? What kind of forces are we dealing with? I think it's clear that the ancients just presumed that these things existed, these beings existed. So how do you personally conceive of the gods?
I perceive the gods to be divine personalities which are eternal and which are most properly acknowledged and worshipped and placated through telling and learning and telling of the myths, which are true but did not necessarily occur in this physical realm in the sense that we would perceive as mortals. But they are true, but they don't. They're not the same thing as the gods themselves. The myths have symbolic value for understanding the divine personalities, rather than being like family history or something like that. So that when reading myth, as Julian advises, you should always be looking for the meanings within. The gods, though, the gods in myths can die. My gods, they die in myths, and they can be reborn as well. They can go to hell and come back out of hell. So all these things can be seen as inconsistent with something that is an absolute eternal principle. But that's because the myths themselves are not history. They're not telling of history. They're lessons for understanding the gods. And the gods need to be placated through rite, and the rite has to have a sacrificial element. There is no substitute for that in my belief system. You can't serve the gods through right action or something like that, or like through good intentions. You can't project goodwill outwards as a sacrifice. It has to be a physical. You have a physical form. You have to engage physically in a rite which establishes ritual space within it, and then offer something physical up to the gods to placate them. And that doesn't necessarily imply that they need those things that you offer to them. That they don't need anything because they're eternal gods. But you, as a contingent being, it is right for you to honor what is uncontingent, and is pure metaphysics. So, and that's done through the rituals which are established by our ancestors, and which we are able to discern from historical sources, archaeological sources, and through the actually, the wider you look at the Indo-European world, it becomes clear that there are common formats for rite, and it's quite easy to see how a proper ritual needs to be held.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've seen a lot of that echoed in Proclus in his commentaries on the Republic. He discusses, for a couple chapters, the prohibition against the poets that is talked about in the Republic. Socrates says you shouldn't let young children hear about the gods laughing at Hephaestus, for example, or the gods crying, or like these heroes, breaking down and not being the kind of moral exemplars that Plato's looking for. But then Proclus reads it in like, these are mystical tools ultimately, and you have to have a certain level of initiation to be able to read the symbols, to be able to make the most out of this. And then your other point, I also see echoed in the Republic itself, actually, with, the gods are like the sun, always emanating their energies, always giving, and it's just a matter of us kind of turning ourselves towards them. Now, how you do that is the interesting question. And the Platonists had this idea of theurgy, which you mentioned. Iamblichus was one of the first Neoplatonists to really emphasize, although perhaps there's even evidence of a similar concept in Plato himself. But, I can see the argument from tradition in saying our ancestors discovered these ways and means of contacting higher beings. And we don't have a comprehensive theory of how to do this from scratch today. So we're kind of left with no recourse but to emulate our ancestors. Do you accept the possibility of a more kind of scientific knowledge of what's going on with theurgy and, innovation in ritual spaces? Could it be that, for example, our Norse pagan ancestors were mistaken about some elements of their worship, and with a more kind of scientific knowledge of the gods, we would change some things? Or do you think just the appeal to tradition is the most secure, best way to go?
I think the appeal to tradition must always be present, no matter what other decisions we take, including the decision to accept innovation. Innovation in this context is never valuable unless it is something that returns us to a previous knowledge that was lost, because I don't believe that through a process of, if by science you mean like a recording, literally recording repeatable results in the effect of prayer or ritual, could ever yield data that would be sufficient to justify one form of ritual from another, because there is not necessarily a consistent response from deities in answering to prayers, and there are so many factors that can't be measured. Not all people are equal. That is essential, and not all people have the favor of the gods. So not all people will be able to interact with the gods in the same way. Not all people will have their prayers answered. Some Platonic views don't even think that. I mean, this is why I start to depart from Platonic views. They start to go down the route of like, you don't actually pray for things because the gods will answer them, because gods don't actually manifest things in this world. It's only because it's right and pious to ask for things because you need them, not because the gods will give them. But I do believe, in contrast to that the gods do and can answer prayers. uh, providing that sacrifices are met, which is the sort of religion that's depicted in Homer. And I think Plato was a little bit concerned by it because it didn't gel with his philosophy properly in all cases. But when they make promises, on the beach, if you give me victory in this battle, I'll give you this many cattle in sacrifice. It's pretty unambiguous what Homeric, what Bronze Age Greek religion was like. And it's the same kind of thing you see in the Rig Veda, where they're talking about sacrificing animals, and later the Vedantists are saying, no, you misunderstood, you mistranslated it. It's not really gonna. I mean, some people will fall for that. To me, I think that's a cope. It's quite obvious that early Greek religion, early Indian religion is the same as Norse religion in the sense that people are offering things to the gods in exchange for something that they believe the gods can give them. As for making mistakes, absolutely, I believe that our ancestors could make mistakes, and I think that even the Greek philosophers were recognizing that. Like, how do you know when you pray to an entity, a being, and you witness an apparition of some kind? How do you know that's not a demon, a daimon? How do you know it's whatever? A ghost of an ancestor, a ghost of a foul daimon, some kind of cruel daimon attached to material, or is it a higher daimon? And even I can't remember which Platonist answered this. I think it was he said that even if the gods that we worship are daimonia, we should still worship them, because the daimons were created by the gods, and therefore they are of the one, they are all part of the divine, and it was therefore proper to propitiate daimons anyway. And there's another Platonic view that when you interact with an idol, sometimes an idol, when you pray to it, you can see it moving, or it speaks to some people. That's been recorded in Egypt, Greece, Scandinavia. Many Scandinavians said they had a talking Odin idol or whatever. It's something that's across the world seen. I've witnessed myself. People in Indonesia, the Batak people, describe how they have talking and moving idols. Now, sometimes they use machinery to help move, but they're talking also about a spirit moving it. Now, the Platonic view, at least in some of the Platonist view, is that this is not a god animating the statue. It is a daimon who serves that god as an intermediary between the highest divine realm and our physical realm. And so that's the closest you can get to a god, is a daimon. So in which case, of course, you should honor a daimon. This is using Greek terminology, but if we have things like a fylgja in Norse terminology, fylgja. There are many types, like a kinfylgja, like is this guardian spirit of a family or a group. But you can have an individual fylgja, and we can see in sagas like Håkon Jarl, a very pious pagan leader of Norway. He made sacrifices to an idol of a fylgja, which is not a god. That's basically like a daimon. So it's the same concept. They weren't amazingly concerned, although they had. Like this hierarchy you've described, it doesn't matter that you're worshipping something lower in the hierarchy, because it's always pointing upwards. Mm-hmm. And that's why even in late antiquity, Platonists are able to integrate aspects from Semitic religion, like from Christians and Jews that they're interacting with, so that you can have angels and archons on the same hierarchy as daimons and gods. Because it doesn't make a difference. They just slot in there, and you're always aiming upwards anyway.
Yes, absolutely. Which now raises the question of that peak of this kind of pyramid. What is it all aiming towards? Olympiodorus was comfortable characterizing Platonism in monotheistic terms. He existed at the very end of the Alexandrian school, and everyone had basically converted to Christianity at this point. Justinian had, closed down many of the other competing universities. So Olympiodorus had to kind of work within the limitations of his time, kind of like us in certain ways. But I can buy his reasoning that ultimately all of the gods are manifestations of one central force, one divinity, call it the one, the good, like the Platonists do, or whatever you want to call it, Brahman. That aspect, some people would call that monotheism. some people would call that mysticism. How do you reconcile polytheism itself versus this kind of, unical quality to the divine?
Well, I don't think it's proper and right to attempt to worship that which is incomprehensible. You can't engage with that. It's unintelligible. Whether some Platonists call it the ineffable one, and others call it the utterly ineffable, because even calling it a one is too much of it's too presumptuous. In either case, it's very far beyond our comprehension. And so if you were to make an idol of it, or to try and focus your spiritual energy on a physical point to represent it, you would be in error, I think, because any representation of it would be a misrepresentation of it, and it would only serve to distort your understanding of it. It can't be understood except by its lower manifestations, which we are more capable of, more intelligible to us as mortal beings. The gods being the best and most correct and upright way for a man to engage with the divinity. Gods are anthropomorphic for a reason, because they're our way of perceiving the divine. The highest is perhaps it may be spiritually beneficial to consider or meditate upon the highest, but it's not a god necessarily in the way that we think of the gods. And I think there's a reason why the Indians don't build temples to Brahma. It's not really in Indonesia. They move it to a Cynthia, which is the same kind of thing. Like it's like a one single god above the others, but they don't worship him really. And the one Platonists don't make a temple to the one. It's just not the done thing. So it's kind of like, as an individual, I might recognize there is a certain oneness of humanity, but that doesn't mean that if that someone else experiences something, I experience it. I experience everything as an individual through my physical form, and to pretend that I don't would be to deceive myself. So I have to experience things as in the form that I'm in the way that I exist now. And the proper way to experience the divine in this way is through the gods and through the established rites of our ancestors.
Yeah. Again, reminded of Proclus, and I realize I'm mispronouncing that. It's supposed to be Proclus. I've always said Proclus. I'll continue to say Proclus. But the path back is through the steps from whence you came, basically. Like, your proper good is in your productive cause, and if there were any mediaries between you and that productive cause, you have to return through those same intermediaries, which is just a kind of logical principle. Like, in any organization, if you're a low-level employee, you don't go straight to the CEO with your concerns. You go to lower management, and it's just kind of the way of things. It has a certain logic to it.
It makes sense. Even the Christians have, it's interesting in the Bible and in the Quran as well, Muhammad interacts with an angel, Mary interacts with an angel. But a lot of Christians, I think, especially in medieval times, Catholics and stuff, would be much more inclined to worship saints and to ask saints for help, to make offerings to saints in exchange for help, in a form of religion that's far more consistent with that of their ancestors. Right. I think it's quite recently Christianity's moved so strongly away from this. I don't think people pray to angels. They don't pray maybe Mexicans and whatever, South Americans pray to saints still a lot, but I don't see Europeans doing that so much.
Yeah. Also, that reminds me of in the Cratylus, Plato makes the claim basically that the ancient race of the Hellenes, before the time of Homer and all of that, became a race of daimons. So many of the daimons there in his time were actually from that ancient race. So that's basically the same as Catholics venerating the saints, looking to the saints for guidance. So there are 2 points I want to get to now. So this question, can a human soul move up the hierarchy, as Plato seems to say in the Cratylus? Can you move into that kind of spirit realm in after this life? Is there a rebirth in other realms in that way? And maybe before we get to that, this issue of the oneness of the divine and the multiplicity of the gods, it seems as though the intermediary step there is like a henotheism, where there has to be kind of one chief among the gods, or at bare minimum, there has to be kind of one center of your own personal worship. Again, Plato says that each of us is in the train of one or the other of the gods, through our kind of journey through the cosmos. So I don't know which one of those you want to hit, and I can take us back.
It's perfectly possible that the gods themselves don't know the one any better than we do. The gods aren't. There are limitations to the gods too. That I believe in, like I believe in an order which I call Weird, the fate, which governs all things, and including the gods. And that may be that may be in some manifestation of the one in a way. But I like in the prayer of the Rig Veda, it says the Nasadiya Sukta is the hymn of creation. It says that at the beginning, then even non-existence was not there, nor existence. There was no air then, nor the space beyond it. What covered it? Where was it? In whose keeping? Was there then cosmic fluid in depths unfathomed? Then there was neither death nor immortality, nor was there then the torch of night and day. The one breathed windlessly and self-sustaining. There was that one then, and there was no other. At first there was only darkness wrapped in darkness. All this was only unillumined cosmic water. That one which came to be enclosed in nothing arose at last, born of the power of knowledge. In the beginning desire descended on it. That was the primal seed born of the mind. The sages who have searched their hearts with wisdom know that which is kin to that which is not, and they have stretched their cord to cross the void, and know what was above and what below. Seminal powers made fertile mighty forces. Below was strength, and over it was impulse. But after all, who knows and who can say whence it all came and how creation happened? The gods themselves are later than creation, so who knows truly whence it has arisen? Whence all creation had its origin, the Creator, whether he fashioned it or whether he did not. The Creator who surveys it all from the highest heaven, he knows, or maybe even he does not know. That I love as a prayer, because it's confessing, like we can all say with confidence what we think the God's doing, this, that. We don't really know. And we can we can approach things like the Greeks with presuming there's reason in things, and then come to a logical conclusion about the nature of divinity. But I think it's always good and humbling to remember that we don't know, and we can't say with 100% certainty what preceded the gods or whatever, or even if the gods know themselves. And I just as the Catholics have their sacred mysteries, we pagans can celebrate that which we don't know as well. So what was the other part of your question? There was a few parts of it then.
Yeah, most directly related is the issue of henotheism. So do you believe there is an order among the gods, there is some kind of hierarchy. Is there one chief god that you could relate to, that you could kind of idealize and worship?
Well, I think that most Indo-European religions, and like similar to other religions around the world, have a central male deity, a sky father, a celestial father, and in our tradition that's Odin or Woden, and he is the king of the gods. He is in charge of the other gods, but he's not the one. I don't think that it's Zeus is not the one. Although some Platonists sometimes like a kind of equate him with it, but I don't think that's correct. Zeus is not the one, and it's unknowable, ineffable. I don't even try to approach it in my right at all. Actually, I just talk about the gods that I can approach, and it doesn't necessarily stand to reason that just because Odin or Zeus is the highest in the pantheon that you should go directly to them and not to other ones. That isn't. It depends on the issue in question, what you're asking for, and you placate that god with offerings, and you invoke them with the epithets that are relevant to the reason for the invocation. So if that god is associated with, strength, then you want to say that, and then you can ask them to help them make you strong or something like that.
Yeah, and Romans did this to an extreme. They had their god of the threshold, god of obviously the hearth, god of basically everything, and you would invoke the proper god for the proper occasion. But there's also this idea in Platonism that we are kind of essentially bound to one peculiar deity corresponding to our rank and station in this life. Just like there's a hierarchy among the gods, there's a hierarchy among daimons and human beings, and so we kind of fit analogically in a certain train with a certain particular. Is that idea in Norse paganism as well?
You asked earlier as well about, is it possible you want to talk about rebirth, and also was it possible for a human to join like a higher sphere, like become another being like daimon? Yes, I believe it is, and that's recorded not only in the Greek idea of people becoming daimons, but the equivalent of like an angel in the Germanic thing is the elves. And it specifically says in several sources that elves, that a person reincarnated as an elf. So, and it's always heroic, like famous people. So it doesn't mean that all elves necessarily were reincarnated heroes. But similarly, also in Platonic theology, this hierarchy in Platonism has heroes as a category of beings. So they become associated with the moon in the hierarchy. They go up. I think that's correct, that they go up as high as the moon, and that depends on the way that they live as well. They become their souls become a different being. I believe that similar things existed for many traditions. That there are some people who are that because of their conduct in life, they go up higher, or maybe that was already predetermined because their soul was already heroic before they even it entered their body, so that they were, of course, just returning back to the heroic realm, or an elf or whatever. The idea of reincarnation seems to me, I've seen evidence of it in the Celtic religion, in the Germanic religion. I'll go into detail on that. The Slavic religion, there's evidence of it talking about there, even as late as Christian times, they're still believing in rebirth. And of course, more famously in the religions of India, the Dharmic religions like Buddhism and Hinduism. But there, it has a unique form where you can reincarnate as an animal. And the Platonists say, it's not that animal has a different kind of soul from a human. So it's not possible for a human soul to go into an animal, to reincarnate an animal, because there's a different category of being. And I don't see any evidence in the European paganism either. They don't talk about humans reincarnating as animals at all. They only talk about, in fact, in Germanic tradition specifically, you reincarnate in your descendants. So it's not even in other random human beings. You can be a reincarnation of an ancestor, and you can aid the passage of the soul of an ancestor into a child by giving that child the name of the ancestor. So that way you can encourage the return of a noble soul that you want to return and you want to have as your child. So that, some people will say, contradicts the fact that many of these religions, or religions with the caveat I already mentioned, have notions of an underworld or other destinations of the soul after death, but that isn't contradictory, and you understand that the idea of a unified soul is certainly alien to these traditions, and that the soul is, using the term soul is a problem here, but the human is made up of composite parts. The soul is made of composite parts, one of which can be equated to a daimon. We are partly a daimon, and therefore might have a connection to the material realm, and that must return to that material realm. Other parts can be associated with the fulgur, which is like, I use the comparison of a daimon there, but then obviously it means not one that's attached necessarily to matter. But my belief is that, you can simultaneously have these two, rebirth and the underworld, and also that there's an interesting studies on the Indo-European conception of the underworld, whereby it seems that people, and we can see this in the Orphic mystery cult as well as in the cult and the description of the Odinic view, there is in the underworld a well or spring of some kind containing water that causes the dead to forget their life. And there is an initiatory cult where you can go past that, beyond a white tree, and you drink from a different body of water, which will not cause you to lose your memories.
Right.
But rebirth, in order to be reborn, the soul has to lose its memories. So this process in hell, the Germanic word for the underworld was hell, not the Christian term, it's a Germanic word. But hell, it seems to be a kind of a process through which the souls need to be cleansed of their attachments to the material realm before they can be reborn and reincarnated in another form.
Yeah, absolutely. And that shows up in Plato in, I think, the Phaedo and also the End of the Republic. And it actually has echoes going all the way back, according to Joseph Campbell, to 15,000, 20,000 BC, with the first kind of plant cultivating societies, not full-on agricultural societies, but Campbell has it through North Africa, through the Near East, in the kind of Upper Paleolithic, later half of the Upper Paleolithic, moving that's eastward all the way through ultimately Melanesia, even Polynesia. You have these cults involving like trying to remember the way to get through this maze of the underworld. It obviously shows up in the Egyptian religion, even in obscure Melanesian tribes. They'll literally try to memorize very diligently these patterns that they think will kind of guide them on that underworld journey. So it's definitely an interesting topic. It has a lot of reverberations. Are you a fan of Campbell? Do you agree, it's kind of a tangent, but do you agree with his broadest dichotomy of spiritual traditions, whereas the kind of planting societies of the equatorial belt and then the great hunt tradition of the north?
I've not read Campbell, but I'm familiar with his theories in general. I'm not the monomyth and things. I'm not amazingly keen on this like mechanistic function of religions, like a theory of that, like kind of Spengler's theories of history and things are similar. I hope that noise isn't too disturbing for him. My neighbour's just got a chainsaw out. I think that these commonalities in these religions could reflect a migration of ideas, or it could just be that, a spearhead in one part of the world becomes the same as a spearhead in another part of the world because there's only one way to make a spearhead streamlined. And so it's the same thing. It's convergence of design, because if you want to develop a way to remember your life as you enter the underworld, then there's probably only one way to do it. And I'm very more interested in. I just sent the link to you to this new thesis, a couple of years old actually, but called Orpheus, Odin, and the Indo-European Underworld by Eric Dodge, and he is the one who's just showing specifically like how the Orphic and the Odinic examples, as well as other Indo-European examples, show a clear idea of waters of memory and waters of forgetfulness, these two types of water in the underworld, and that you need to remember the when you're in there, when you're in the underworld, when you reach hell, you have to remember this if you want to go past the waters of forgetfulness, and then another reality becomes possible for you instead of rebirth. Whether rebirth is good or bad is kind of ambiguous in some of the traditions, whereas in India it's absolutely certain that rebirth is not desirable. But the way to get away from samsara there is through your actions in life. Whereas it seems all these other traditions in Europe had this idea of the action actually after death was crucial for how you would be reborn. And you could prepare for it through these rituals and ritual remembering and these gold plaques which engrave these instructions on what to do after you die. Campbell is not very influential on me in general.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, going back to this issue of the multiplicity of the soul, there is debate among Neoplatonists about, how possible animal transmigration may be for human souls. And I think Proclus ultimately kind of reaches a reconciliation position where there's a way that a human soul can inhabit an animal body without actually losing that rational component. There's also this idea of like there being a truest part of the soul, right? If it's manifold, is our identity kind of principally situated in one aspect or another of the soul? In Advaita Vedanta and the Upanishads, it seems to point to a kind of identity between the true self and then that ultimate reality that's kind of beyond comprehension. So what do you think about that? What is the true self? The Platonists kind of sometimes point to like the rational soul or intellect is like more true to the core of ourselves. You're muted again. You're muted again. Tom, you're muted.
Sorry again.
That's all right.
Yeah, I tried to address this very subject with a video back in 2017 about the tripartite Indo-European soul. And there I argue by comparing the tripartite nature of the soul in India with the Platonic view that we can arrive at a conclusion that there was an original Indo-European one, which is maybe a little bit of a tenuous argument to make because I only used two examples and they're quite late. But I showed that there are equivalents for these concepts in Germanic religion as well, so that maybe strengthened it. But yeah, I generally find compelling this argument for the tripartite soul in a hierarchical sense, and the highest part is equivalent to logisticon, to the highest part of the universe, as above, so below. So well, universe is not the right term, but of being. So to me, the thumos, or the chest part that desires glory is higher as well than the purely physical part associated with the generative functions. So I think some parts return to the soil or return to matter because they are of matter, and I think that they reflect in your personality as well, that concerns relating purely to matter, and other parts slightly higher concern like fame and kleos in the European sense, and then the highest of all goes beyond that. So what the concerns for like nationhood, race, family, that's in the second category, whereas like the individual needs of the organism and the experience of the individual on the third category, and the highest pertaining to that which is eternal, always was eternal, and must remain eternal. So yeah, that can't die.
Right. We just read the Alcibiades, the sometimes disputed Platonic dialogue that served as an introduction for the Neoplatonists, and this is one of those central topics. What is kind of the core of the self? Who are we trying to benefit ultimately? So I'd like to hear your take a little bit more, because you intimated at this difficulty of karma. Where do we work out these difficulties? Is it here during our lives with moral action, right ritual? Is it on the other side? Is it kind of like the Egyptians would spend a lot of money for their funeral processions, at the end for their arrangements, in order to give them the best shot of navigating that kind of maze in the afterworld? Is most of the battle, after we die? Sometimes I have the sense that, dreams are a kind of check of whatever that trial would be at the end. I don't know if you've had dreams like this, but you experience like moral temptations in a dream, and it's harder to restrain yourself in the dream because you're kind of guided by subconscious, not fully rational action. It just seems like it's a hint that like even this lowest part of yourself has to be brought into order in order to avoid being drawn into being drawn by the siren's call on the other side. So anyway, this issue of karma, like is most of the battle here? What do you think about karma in general? What is the kind of goal that we're aiming at? What part of ourselves are we improving through karma? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, as I said before, concerning rebirth, it's not entirely clear in the Western traditions to what extent it is desirable to be reborn. I think there's often very clear desire to cause noble ancestors to be reborn, by the living want them to be reborn, which goes against the ideas of Eastern philosophy, with the samsara being entirely undesirable. It would seem like that would be unfair, like a malicious act against that's dead soul to bring it back. So I think that it's a little bit complicated there, and I don't believe that I know the answer, and I don't think necessarily it was ever known. And people could honestly say that perhaps it isn't always desirable to be reborn, and perhaps it isn't always desirable not to be. It seems that in all the sources, the underworld is an undesirable place to be, not in the sense that it's hell is eternal torture in the Christian description, but hell, none of the people in hell seem particularly happy about being there. They're not all tortured. There is in the Germanic version, like in the Aeneid, there are people who are punished for misdeeds in life, specific kinds of misdeeds. In the Germanic tradition, it mentions rapists and murderers, but of course, their definition of rape and murder would exclude raping and murdering people from other societies, which was perfectly fine. So it would only be people within their culture. Basically law breakers and oath breakers, people who have contradicted the, sworn sacred traditions of their ancestors. But it's hard to know whether what extent they wanted to be reborn. I think that the kind of dreams you described, I've had similar things, and I do think that ultimately the objective is for the three elements, all the components of the soul, to be in alignment, not in like the body, the head, the chest, and the stomach are all functioning as one organism. So the idea is that the soul should function in that same way towards one objective. And I do think, by the example of our forefathers, not like the Egyptians, people in this part of the world, the Bronze Age barrows here, the Anglo-Saxon barrows, the Viking barrows, they went to great efforts to ensure that the dead were equipped for the next world. Although it's been well documented as well, there's a notion that they were present in their barrows while also being present in hell, so that you could go to the barrow, interact with the dead within that barrow, who were able to travel from hell to the barrow and back again at will. So their notion of being dead and place and time of the dead is a bit complicated, because they have a notion of hell as a physical place almost, under a subterranean realm, as it's widely conceived of even in the Christian tradition still. But in the Germanic tradition, it was seen as cold rather than hot. A cold place down and north, somehow to the north. And they obviously needed a boat, because they're often buried with boats, and the Egyptians also seem to have associated boats with the afterlife. But the problem is with the archaeological record, not all of them are buried this way. So if it's an absolute necessity to have a boat, why didn't they all get given boats? Or even the ones who didn't have a boat, didn't they get, like, I don't know, a paddle or something? I don't know. But they don't get anything. Like, you don't get, like, people with really small boats who didn't have much money, and people with lots of money have big boats. It's just people with lots of money, famous people, get big boats, and everyone else doesn't get a boat. So it's a bit unclear. And you also have, earlier Indo-European traditions where wagons and chariots are included in burials. Were those necessary in an earlier conception of the afterlife? Because it doesn't help you cross the body of water, which appears to be an original Indo-European feature. So it's not clear why they're buried often with weapons, why they're buried with grooming tools, but it is clear that they're given food and things that they used in life. That can be gaming pieces to entertain themselves, weapons, symbols of status, including their slaves who are sacrificed to join them. So I would say that the actions in life absolutely do determine the destination of the soul in death. However, other things are also important, including the actions of the soul after death. And presumably, if we look at the Greek traditions and the Orphic tradition, there are ways that one can prepare for that moment in life by memorizing in a ritual way the actions that one will take in hell when one goes there. But I expect that, there are people who, having committed so many misdeeds, they cannot pass through hell without first receiving the punishment, which in the Germanic tradition, Nestrund, involves people being harmed by serpents because they have been oath breakers, just as in the Aeneid, it describes people in the underworld being punished relevant to the misdeeds in life.
Yes, right, okay. So, one possible solution to this is that there is diversity of the kinds of challenges that meet us according to the time and culture and customs. Like, those human souls might be connected to another species of afterlife than us in our time and place with our challenges, and then at the same time, perhaps members of different castes within a society would face, somewhat different challenges. So much of what you're saying, I am reminded of instances in the dialogues when Plato, incorporates these sorts of myths. And so I want to kind of return to Plato a little bit. And again, I mentioned before, what I see Plato doing is trying his best to synthesize these religious currents that he was exposed to, both from his own culture, nearby cultures to a lesser extent, perhaps, and then this rationalistic philosophy, the Pythagorean tradition, the Eleatics, even Heraclitus. I mean, so much of the surrounding culture of his time and place is there, brought into a harmony in the dialogues, which raises the question, how do we bring all of these facets and factors of life into harmony ourselves if we, chose a pagan path, seeing as how the surrounding society is not generally pagan? How do we have this harmony that Plato is going after? And then, because Plato was responding to the rationalistic currents in his day, and he tried to do his best to complete a rational system. Do you think his basic mission was correct, and that's how he tried to get this harmonizing effect? Or, is there something else we should be doing rather than completing philosophy and then going on to theurgy, as he seems to suggest?
So I'm not clear on the question. You're asking, do I think Plato's attempt to reconcile the varying philosophies that he experienced in his culture, was that a good thing? Or
was his intention, was he on the right track in the way he tried to solve the problem? It seems like he wanted to harmonize all of these currents, and he went about it through trying to subsume all of them within a common rationalistic framework, which we call Platonism, right? Is that the way to do it?
Well, it seems, yeah. I don't feel that I could contradict Plato, and I think he was on the right path, and I think he was divinely inspired to do those things, to write some of the things he wrote. Not all of them. I think when he goes in, the parts of Timaeus where he's writing about triangles and stuff just leave me cold. I don't have any interest in talking about the triangles that make up atoms or whatever.
I love triangles, but
whatever they are. But it's but I think he was on the right track. Yeah. We can try and do the same, but with the caveat that there's all kinds of things, intellectual currents around now that are probably completely wrong, and that trying to integrate them into a worldview, a correct philosophy, a true philosophy, as Kelsa says, would only corrupt that philosophy, lead us further away from divinity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, treating unequals equally leads to inequality, which, to each his proper place, and to each tradition its proper role within this true philosophy, whatever it may be, which seems reasonable. Great. So I just had in mind where I wanted to go, but honestly, I can't quite remember. So let's take a break with questions from the chat. So someone says, the real question is, what is Survive the Jive's haircut routine?
I don't think anyone's ever asked me that. Haircut. I go to a barber's and I say I want a short back and side, all around there with a slight blend, and then I don't get it cut for another month, so it ends up looking like this. It just grows long, and this is how it looks. There's no substances in it. This is just how my hair looks. It's thick. My friends say I must have Indian DNA or something because I have the thick hair of an Asian, but I don't have any Indian ancestry. It's just I have very thick hair.
All right. Roland Shander says, this is actually a good point. If we are Faustian, why LARP is Greeks? Why LARP is Germanics, who exists no more? This is kind of common critique of paganism. Just accept Newtonian tradition. We are talking about worldly forces anyways. I'm not entirely sure where he's going with that.
I don't understand what he's on.
Why LARP is Greeks? Why LARP is pagans who don't exist anymore? Basically, how do you respond to this contention that these traditions died a long time ago, and we should just kind of adapt to the world that we're actually in.
Okay, well, I don't think the gods are dead. It's quite simple. They're real and they need to be placated. It doesn't make a difference. Well, history is just a human attempt at understanding events as they occurred in the past, and it's utterly insufficient even in its stated goals. Whereas the gods are real, eternal, and need to be placated. So it doesn't really matter whether there are gaps in our history and our knowledge of events that have occurred or may not have occurred. And also the idea of it being dead is somewhat. I did try to demonstrate this with a meme list that I made. I'm glad to see it started going around. I just listed like all the different events, because people say we've been Christian for at least 1,000 years, but I mean that's true, sort of. But also, some places of Europe have been Christian for much longer, but there's always been some pagans around, and like even in like the 19th century Sweden, there's people taking an idol and carrying it around and worshipping a god of an idol in 19th century Sweden, not as the aristocrats who dressed up as Vikings in 19th century Sweden and pretended to hail Odin, which they did too. And you could say that 19th century aristocrats were laughing. I mean, 19th century Swedish peasants worshipping an idol and dragging it around the fields to bless the corn, and they called it the corn god, and it represents Thor. And there's earlier ones from the 1600s. Raymond Tellier's talking about that. And in England, 1776, William Hutchinson talks about how people in Northumberland decorated an idol of who he called Ceres, the Roman goddess of the grains, and carried her around the fields to bless the crops. And in 1776, of course it wasn't Ceres, it was probably some English goddess. But I made a whole list of that. I was just starting at the 19th and 18th century to show you, but you got them in the 1300s, 1400s, 1500s, 1600s. There's never been a time when people haven't been practicing paganism. And one of the main concerns of the church is this problem that they have, that people didn't really give up paganism in many respects. Now, there isn't a Bible. But why do you assume that we ever needed one? We never had one in the first place. We didn't need to have a rule book for the religion because it had to survive for it to be justified. Because you're assuming that the foundations of the religion that sought to destroy paganism needs to be present in paganism for paganism to be legitimate. But there's absolutely no logical reason for that to be the case.
Right, yeah, and from what we were talking about before about the underworld and, kind of internalizing and memorizing the kinds of challenges that you'll face, it's actually a kind of existential threat having this set of scriptures and this system that you can kind of refer to as like, oh, that's what I believe in. It's not in my heart, it's not like in my soul with me to help me through these challenges. It's just you can point to it and say, it all makes sense. You can ask the priests about it. Anaximander, are the Henads pure actuality? They have no karmic debt. I would say they have no karmic debt, but they are not pure actuality because there is the hyparxis energeia distinction in the Henads for Proclus. But do you have any comments on that? Okay. All right. So I remembered the other question that I wanted to ask you about. Obviously, I've identified as a Christian for a long time, but also a lot of my theological positions are pagan, Platonist, Hindu. I got into Hinduism, Advaita Vedanta, studied with monks for a little while and, asked them a lot of questions. And I've internalized that system, and I view Christianity really through that lens. And I don't think it's ahistorical for me to do that. I think you can come up with a fair reading that harmonizes paganism and Christianity. So what do you think about that? Like the relationship between Christianity and paganism? Most people think it has to be hostile. I think there is a way of fitting it together if you agree on certain vocabulary about the gods, but the basic kind of metaphysical hierarchy can work for both Christianity and paganism. Obviously, Neoplatonism did function for both groups.
Yeah, there's nothing in paganism that requires me to hate Christians. There's nothing that requires me to attack them or anything. It's not a religious duty. Many of nicest people I ever met have been Christians. I generally like Christians. I live in largely Christian community, so in that sense it's not a problem. We know that the early Anglo-Saxons, when they encountered Christ as a god, they just put his idol in King Radwell put the idol of Christ next to Woden and Thunor, and that was not seen as a problem. And similar things happened in India when Jesus was introduced there. Like British people continue to worship Shiva and whoever else alongside Christ. The problem only arises when there is the Old Testament Jewish commands to destroy idols of the Gentiles are adopted by Gentile converts to Christianity, and then of course you're committing an evil act, like an act against the gods. You're trying to destroy a religious holy artifact. There's no room for negotiation there. There's only retaliation. It makes the possibility of reconciliation impossible once someone has accepted that they have a sacred duty to destroy what is sacred, because they've completely turned around they've been completely turned upside down on what is and isn't correct action. It is never a correct action to destroy something sacred, but there is the possibility that Christianity could be altered. I mean, the funny thing is, Christians nowadays in like the Church of England or the Church of Sweden have directly gone against so much of of the scripture. It says women can't even talk in church, yet now they have women being priests. Now, I don't care. That's not my problem. That's their problem if they're for it or against it. If I'm not a Christian, but if they can stop, they know the Catholics no longer pray for the souls of Jews because the Jews found it offensive. And that implies that the Jews don't require their souls to be saved anymore. They didn't require Christ even. That's what the Pope seems to be implying. And that if the Christians will accept that Christ is necessary for the salvation of the Jews, then they basically admitted that anything can be changed in the religion. So why do they have to uphold a duty to destroy the holy sites of the pagans? Obviously I know that there are reasons for people with power in the West will subvert some elements of that religion and not others, and they have no reason to want to defend pagans, but they do other groups, which have enabled the apparent reconciliation of Islam and Christianity, but it's a very surface level one. It doesn't reflect an actual reconciliation. But yeah, I mean, as I say, I have no animosity towards Christians whatsoever, but I have a duty of response to provocation. So if someone was to attempt to harm me, my family, kinsmen, idols of the gods, I have to retaliate. I don't have a choice. It's a matter of duty in that respect. And then that makes it very difficult. I would like to see some kind of mutual cooperation between Christians and pagans towards our shared goals of basically approaching the divine, and Christ in himself as a redeeming figure, he was contemporarily known as a sorcerer or a wizard of some kind. He came among the Jews and tried to reform Judaism in that time. There's no reason that any Gentile of the West could consider that a bad thing. He may have been positive influence on them. Some of the Platonists, like Celsus, were more. Some of the anti-Christian rhetoric from Platonists comes from people who dislike Christians just because they were Jews, because they were also anti-Semitic. But others don't dislike the Jews; they just dislike the Christians and say that Christianity was a corruption of Judaism. Because some of the Platonists, of course, value the antiquity of Judaism, because at least Judaism was an ancient tradition belonging to a people that they successfully maintained with esoteric dimensions as well. Whereas Christianity, they considered, was a departure from that. But in any case, Christ, I think, could not, as an individual, I don't believe he was a god, but I mean, he existed, I'm sure, and he may have been a holy man, worthy of reverence.
Right. So it was just good timing here. So Dario Mercedes asks a question for me. Do you think Jesus is the only incarnation, or are there others? Could there be another incarnation in the future? So the way you phrased it there was a good man. What about this issue of incarnation? in the Elements of Theology, Proclus talks about this kind of chain of suspension from the henads moving kind of vertically straight down the great chain of being. So not all souls are divine, but some are in that divine column, right? Directly descended from the gods. And among those souls, there is one chief soul. There is, one highest soul. That's the way that I've conceived of the avatar, or the incarnation of God. What do you think about that idea of the incarnation? You probably wouldn't accept Jesus as fitting the bill for that, but is it possible? There are probably many types of theophany that are possible, many types of divine appearances, but the avatar specifically, what do you think about that?
Well, yeah, yes, definitely. Within the Germanic tradition, it's pretty much the standard way to honor a leader is to compare their actions in this world to mythic actions of the gods, and so to show that they are a reflection of the divine in that sense. So a man who I consider to be holy, Jarl Haakon, who I previously mentioned, he was compared to Odin in many of his respects, but also to Yngvi Frey. So two gods his life was said to mirror. And in that sense, he was like an avatar of those gods. His soul was probably, higher in the hierarchy, so that it was closer to those gods, so that he could more perfectly reflect their being in a human form. Although he was not I can say like he was divinely inspired. We talk sometimes like people call Julian the divine or Plato the divine, but they only in the sense that they were higher and closer to the gods than I am or normal people are, but not in the sense that they were gods. But in that sense, Jesus can certainly be. He could have been a necessary reforming, influence on of the divine on mankind in that region of the Levant under Roman rule at that time in history. Perhaps that was necessary. But even I've had this discussion with Muslims when I used to live in the Muslim area of London. You say that every people had the prophets of Allah, not just the Arabs. And the Arabs only have the privilege of having the final word of Allah delivered to them. But he sent prophets to every race and every people in every time. So I wonder, my response to that would be that, obviously the prophet, so the Teutonic Muhammad, if he existed, either his teachings were not in contradiction to the existing religion, to the extent that he didn't cause any changes to the Germanic pagan religion, or his arguments were not convincing, in which case he can't have been divinely, can't have been supported by the gods, because he would have had more effect on the reality, the material reality. So that's why I don't really go in for that argument. But yeah.
Okay. Back to this issue of the incarnation, just one more time. So it seems like you accept that individual human beings can be divinely inspired, but then back to this kind of tripartite soul, however you want to call it. If there is a highest aspect of the soul that each of us possesses and is most essentially us, and this highest aspect, call it intellect or logisticon or whatever, comes in a spectrum of qualities, more or less partial logisticons, more or less partial intellects, shouldn't there be like one best exemplar of higher nature? Shouldn't there be one human being with like the absolutely unfailing, unerring intellect? That's kind of how I think of the avatar.
Why there should be. So because we've established the hierarchy and ultimately points to the one, and beneath that the gods. So why does there need to be a human intellect above other human intellects?
Well, just as there's a hierarchy among henads and a hierarchy among intellects, there's a hierarchy among souls. So there should be, an equivalent to
the king is the correct manifestation of the divine on earth. That's the function of kingship. So the king automatically has the closest relationship with the gods by virtue of his kingship. in that sense, I would call the king. That would be the role of the king. But if we don't have kings, most of us anymore. We don't have kings in England, even we have a monarchy. We have a queen. But yeah, I think that the original justification for kingship is that, it's a link between, it's a link to the divine. So it would be a more perfect intellect, in the sense that it is more able to intuit divine purpose and meaning than an average intellect.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, if somehow you were able to become King of England, I might drop our differences, bend the knee, and go ahead and go with that. But
if I did, don't worry, I would allow Christians to carry on as normal. I wouldn't persecute them.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thank you. So in India, it seems like, the king wouldn't be this best exemplar. It would be more like a member of the priest caste. So do you think that distinction just reflects the kind of thumatic, spirited nature of the northern nations versus the more intellectual nature of the Aryans?
Which distinction are you talking about regarding the caste system?
Regarding so you said the king in Northern European religious traditions would be this intermediary to the gods, which you saw after the Protestant Reformation, the gods kind of being the head of church and state, very European idea. But in India, the human beings who are the best reflections of the divine are the priests, not the kings themselves. So how do you account for that distinction?
Well, I think in the Germanic hierarchy, as defined in the Rigsthula, it says that there's a confusion because, in Indo-European castes, as identified by Dumézil, there's the priestly, the warrior, and the third function, which is merchants and producers, farmers, etc. In India, that matches up with Dumézil's ideas clearly, because you have the Brahmin priestly caste. The kings in India come from the Kshatriya caste. Is that distortion coming from me?
No, I think I got a phone call and the signal interrupted it. Sorry.
In India, they come from the Kshatriya caste, the warrior caste, but I think they're still higher than the Brahmins in many respects. But maybe I've got that wrong. But some of the later myths seem to or some of the Mahabharata, for example, which I covered in a recent video, this section where it implies that Krishna is higher than the kings, even though Krishna is not from the kingly caste. So there's this kind of idea, as you said, that the king is of the warrior caste and therefore inferior to the ultimate spiritual thing. But that's not in the Germanic theory at all. It doesn't even mention a priestly caste in the description of the origin of the castes of the Germanic people. It just describes how there is the king, and he's of the Jarl kind of warrior caste, same as in India. But also it says that divine knowledge, the runes, which means esoteric knowledge, rune, was taught to him. The rune master is the king. So I think that really, my view is that the priest, the king, and the warrior are actually one caste really initially, and they sort of, because of that, it's not that they're separate hierarchical roles. They're the same caste. But, I mean, they are separate hierarchical roles, but they're from the same caste. So that's why that confusion has happened, in my opinion. It's hard to determine, but the king is privy to divine knowledge. The king is divine in that he is like a Brahmin, and the rune master of the Germanic tradition, who has the knowledge of Odin's esoteric secrets, is the king. And it does seem like rulers, as I said before, like Earl Hakon were compared to the gods by virtue of that. And we know that there were people called Godhis, who were essentially priests, but they're not famous in the same way. And it does seem that they're also leaders, and there's overlap as well with law speakers, like the role of a lawyer. And I think, in the lawyer, in its initial manifestation, the speaker of law is a much higher social classification than it's become. Does it answer the question? But it's hard to
Yeah.
say what in today's society where it would come from. Probably you're right. I think it would need to be from someone who's devoted his life to spiritual practice. Obviously, is going to be higher than someone who's devoted their life to the pursuit of earthly power.
Right. Yeah, we don't want a president slash pope for sure. And I can see it going one of two ways. My first thought with that was the Northern Europeans, like Aristotle says, were just spirited. And so naturally they would elevate the thumatically inclined to the top of society, whereas the Aryans were a little bit more spiritually minded, perhaps. But there's also the idea that, like in the Cratylus, the ancient race is at once philosophically inferior in terms of dianoia, discursive reasoning. Their definitions don't actually equate to these eternal realities. That's the whole substance of the Cratylus, is going through the etymologies of Greek terms and saying that the ancients had a philosophical system sort of like that of Heraclitus. And it was very flux-oriented, but they were wrong in certain respects, and yet they were a superior race to the modern Greeks. So how do you make sense of that? It may be something like, the more integrated and unitive a society and the individuals within that society are, the less you need these fine distinctions philosophically, the less you need these, intense differentiations between social roles, and it makes more sense to have a king slash priest, integrating these functions in particular individuals, just because that kind of personality is more integrated than the peoples of the Punjab, who had been civilized for 10,000 years, right, compared to Scandinavia or northern Germany or something like that. But yeah, it's definitely an interesting question. So there was another one here for you that I wanted to ask you. Let me see. Yeah, Rainus Arian, can we even track Platonism and other axial age spiritual movements as ongoing, real Indo-European traditions? Germanic pagans and Homeric Greeks seem to have less monistic, less life-denying worldviews, which is a common criticism. So maybe this could be like our final question. Exactly how Indo-European was Plato?
That's a good question. Yeah, it is a good question. And I think in 2017, I was very inclined to look at developments of the axial age in different places in the Indo-European speaking world and see them all as evidence of a common Proto-Indo-European root. But the more I've looked at evidence of Proto-Indo-European religion, I do think that there were innovations of the axial age, quite significant ones. And I've got into trouble already when I said I don't think Zoroastrianism, for example, is an example of Indo-European religion exactly. That isn't to say that it's Semitic. It is not a Semitic religion. It comes from an Indo-European culture, the Persian and Iranian culture. But it isn't. It's completely different in spirit to the religion that it diverts from. It's a reforming religion. Calling Zoroastrianism Indo-European is like calling Christianity Jewish. It has its roots there, but Zoroaster changed the Iranian religion as much as Christ changed Judaism. It can be useful to call Christianity Jewish when talking about its origins, but it isn't useful to understand what it is now and its history since its inception to call it Jewish, because it's something other than Judaism since that time. So as for other things like Plato, is he Indo-European? Like, he comes from an Indo-European thought world of Greece, but the category of Indo-European, of course, didn't exist in anyone's mind. They didn't know about it. And some Indo-European people, the Greeks held to reasonably high esteem, like the Scythians at times. They call them barbarians and they speak lower than, but they also bear a sort of grudging respect. But it's not the same respect they bear towards the Egyptians, who are seen as a source of, ancient and wisdom. Arguably, Pythagoras may have taken some of his wisdom from there. Like a lot of Platonic thought, even if Plato himself wasn't influenced by the Egyptians, the Platonists were, and that has nothing to do with Indo-Europeans. So, but then again, to call Platonism a product of Afro-Asiatic thought is just, it doesn't really work either. So the term Indo-European starts off as a linguistic category, and it's still extremely useful and valid in that context. And some people, who I disagree with, would prefer it was only used as a linguistic category. But I think because we now know from genetics that it was certainly also a racial group who spoke that language and spread it, that it can be used in an ethnographic sense as well. And we can associate it with vocabulary, blah, blah, blah. And then also what I'm interested in, with a religious spread of a religious view. But that Bronze Age religion, I think that the Homeric worldview is very Indo-European. It's very similar to the Rig Vedic worldview. But just as the Rig Veda differs very much from later Indian texts, the Homeric epics differ very much from later Greek thought. So to say is it Indo-European or not is kind of like it diverges from Indo-European ideas to some extent, but it's built on top of them. It's not from something else. It's not like the introduction of a foreign thought system into Greece that we're seeing, but it is something different. But that difference is built on what preceded it, and no one. The same thing with Vedanta and the modern practices Sanatana Dharma hate it when Westerners, talk about the Rig Veda and the original Aryans as having like this radically different religion from what they now practice, because as far as we can see in the historical and religious record, there isn't any religious break. It's a continuous flow into the present. But it is only very evident that they're so different when you take either end of that thread and compare them. But if you go along, it seems like a very natural progression from one to the other. I think something similar can be said for Greece. Like it doesn't represent a break from tradition, a break from Indo-European tradition at all. It's a continuation of it, but it does make it, due to the conditions of the age that Plato was living in, very different to what we would have seen on the steppes, 3000 BC, for example.
Mm-hmm. No, that's an excellent point, though. You have from the Rig Veda to the Upanishads in the East, and you have the Homeric religion to Platonic religion in the West. They're basically exact corollaries of each other, just like 400 years later in the West. So yeah, that's a good point to end on. Now, what do you have going on? I know you have your main channel, which everybody should know about. You have Jive Talks, which for some reason YouTube loves to suppress those videos. I always have to check myself in order to see them. I don't know what's going on there. But what else do you have in the works? What are you working on currently?
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. Jive Talks now, since September, I've had my Jive Talks used to be on the Survive the Jive channel, but now the live talks on a separate channel, which it is being suppressed. I don't know why, but my main channel isn't being majorly suppressed, so that's good to know. The video I'm working on next is, I've just done a big video on comparative mythology looking at the figure of Starkat, who is has an exact equivalent in India of Shishupala, or Shishupal, who is this quite transgressive and problematic figure in the Indo-European religions, who does pop up again and again, and it's very interesting. I haven't attempted to fully understand his esoteric function or his metaphysical function in these myths. But I just wanted to use this video to just demonstrate to viewers that this definitely is an ancient archetype in Indo-European religions, and I compared him to the Sigma male memes that people like nowadays. So, but in the next one, I'm actually going to do very soon an analysis of a myth, which I don't really do, and people often ask me to do that, but I don't like to, because I think that mythic analysis is something that should be done in private generally. But there's one specific myth that I am fed up with people deliberately misrepresenting its meaning. It's a Norse myth, and they're trying to actually derive the exact opposite meaning from it than what is intended. And so that in this instance, I consider it acceptable for me to explain the myth, because I'm countering an Adamic momentum that is gathering speed, and I want to try to push against it. So that's the myth in Gylfaginning about how the gods established boundaries, how they built sacred space. They delineate sacred space, and it involves one god, Loki, performing I guess you could say homosexual act, but he transforms into a female horse and is impregnated by a male horse, which is a deeply shameful act. But some people try to use this as justification for things that they ought not to. So yeah, that's what's next up. And thanks for giving me the opportunity to let people know.
Yeah, of course. Well, I mean, thanks for coming on. This is a really fun conversation. Maybe we can talk in the future at some point again. And let's see, is there anything else that I wanted to mention? I have my Plato reading groups if anyone is interested in getting into this. I think the harmonizing function of Plato, making sense out of all of these, I mean, it's kind of what we're all doing with the kind of tattered traditions in general that we've received. Like, we have to put them back together somehow. That's what Plato did. He had to do it. It's not like Plato decided to innovate and become this rationalist and abandon the old ways. The old ways were already collapsed in a very similar situation to ourselves. So anyone who wants to join that, you can look on my Patreon or on, I put my Skype in the description. I'll put Strive the Jive's links for both of his channels in the description. And also, I've supported him on Patreon for a long time. I recommend you do the same. He does really high quality work. But
thank you very much, Eric, for that, and thank you again for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Have a good rest of your day, everybody. Take care.